The following manuscript, held in the library of the University of Louisville, claims to provide a first-hand account of the final days of a tiny rural community in Rowan County, Kentucky, known as Cold Hollow. Other than its approximate position some 5 or 6 miles east of Moorhead, little is recorded in Frankfort's official records about its existence aside from the fact that it was unincorporated as a community around 1869, after an outbreak of consumption had decimated its dwindling population. The name survives only in the title of a small residential road that winds with precarious persistence up into the wooded hills, once the main route into the hamlet. Written by Eugene Macmillan, a lawyer and veteran of the Civil War native to Moorhead, as he lay dying of influenza in the autumn of 1918, it takes the form of a deathbed confession. Discarded as fiction by most who have read it over the course of the intervening decades, the account has no counterparts, for the records of the county sheriff's office on the matter are uncharacteristically vague. The only rumblings of local folklore surrounding Cold Hollow that stretched beyond shadowy rumors and ill omens died with the generation that had witnessed its erasure. Now, only a few local myths about Bigfoot, ghosts, and other such tired small-town legendry haunt the area, leaving these yellowed pages as the last recorded testament to the final days of a long-dead town. Articles in the Louisville papers discussed a meteor shower witnessed by many in Bowling Green on the 11th of September last month, and reading of the sightings has dredged up memories of an event I don't feel inclined to leave forgotten. Given my condition, I don't have long left to recall the story, and as far as I'm aware, most of the others who would know died many years ago. I may well be the last soul left who walked up the hills into Cold Hollow in the summer of '69, and I wouldn't feel right broaching the subject with the Almighty when I've yet to recount it to my fellow men here on earth. The story, fantastic as it sounds, is factual, the final confession of a haunted man. I can only hope that, in the retelling, I manage to shed some of the weight I feel pressing down on me as my time to be called marches nearer. It started with a light in the sky, much the same as the ones in Bowling Green. The meteorite fell in July, when the heat of the summer was hellish, and the grass seemed inclined to bleach in the sun like parched prairie out west. It was a small thing, just a little flash against the night sky, but it happened during Independence Day celebrations in Moorhead, so the whole community saw the light streak down into the hills east of town. Some children planned to forge off into the woods to see what damage it had done, but scolding mothers put that to bed as soon as plans had been hatched. I was seated with a few friends from the war, ex-Confederate volunteers all, grumbling over old memories which at that time were, I suppose, not so old. One, looking off after the falling star, remarked it must be near to Cold Hollow, where the extended Kitchener family and a few other hangers-on dwelt in solitude. After the night wound down and we all went off home, there wasn't much talk of Cold Hollow's fallen star around town. During the war between the states, the Kitchener clan that lived up in Cold Hollow had been staunchly in Washington's corner, which put them at odds with most of the rest of Rowan County, who were firmly in Richmond's camp. It may seem odd now, so many years on, but that was more than enough reason to make most in Moorhead steer clear of old Greg Kitchener's little hamlet above town. In 1869, the war had only been settled for a few years. People were still liable to see neighbors as the enemy in the rural regions of Kentucky if they'd chosen the other side during the schism. I myself avoided representing or trading with more than one man who'd worn the Union blues. Marching up to investigate Cold Hollow from the valley seemed no less foreign to us than marching south into Mexico. So once it was determined that his land was closest to the stone, it was wordlessly decided that it had best be forgotten. Over the next 2 weeks, word would tumble down the trail up to Kitchener's homestead that Greg's daughter, Miriam, had taken ill. This spot of rumor was confirmed when Greg's young son Edward rode through Moorhead on his way to Farmers, the larger town up the road, to try and petition the doctor to ride back with him. It was only after Dr. Van Horn rode down from a visit to Cold Hollow pale and mute that interest crept back up and gossip started to spread. The word in the shops around town was that a strange type of cancer had taken root in Miriam Kitchener, and that her body was racked with crippling tumors and sores the like of which Van Horn had never seen. So shaken by the otherworldly nature of the malady was the doctor that, despite multiple visits from young Edward, he always refused to follow him back up into the hills. Instead, he sent opiates and advice back up the trail with them, murmuring to the residents of Farmers in their wake that he doubted even God's grace could help Miriam Kitchener now. By the dawn of the 3rd week, Edward had ceased his rides, and it was their youngest, Ronnie, who made the trips. Edward was now equally ill, and it was not long before the patchy-haired and increasingly malnourished horse disappeared in kind, leaving Ronnie to trek to Farmers on his own. This went on for several more days before, as Ronnie himself grew more and more bedraggled on his trips, Liza Mailer offered to climb the hills with him. She was a mother herself, and must have pitied the boy. Lord knows his skin, starting to peel in pinkish sores around his wrists and elbows, spoke to the suffering his poor family must be in up above. For his part, Ronnie remained silent, nodding with absent gaze and handing over his bag before following her on shaky legs up the trail, a sick fawn struggling to match its adoptive mother's pace. That evening, when Mrs. Mailer had stumbled at a trot back down the mountains, the pity had gone. Panic had taken hold, and she was crying at dusk when one of the sheriff's deputies spotted her on the road and guided her on his shoulder into town. My friends and I pushed out of the inn upon hearing her sobbing, and Donald, her husband, ran out from amongst us to help the deputy calm Liza. Finally, they were able to get her to the Mailer house, where Donald and the deputy spent the whole of the night trying to get details out of the shaken woman. When Donald came to my door 2 hours before daybreak the next morning, he was visibly frightened. If there was one emotion I believed Donald Mailer incapable of, it was fear. A veteran of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry who had braved the Union fire with me at Perryville in '62, he had been present at every action the 1st Kentucky had undertaken during the war. He was the last of the honor guard to stand down when President Davis was taken captive in Georgia, often muttering to us that he'd have fought to the end in the woods and hollers if only the brass had asked it of him. A fiercer soul didn't breathe air on the face of this earth, and when that scar-faced bear of a man came back shaken by his wife's account of what awaited us up in those hills, I began to take things with some of the gravity they deserved. Donald told me in hushed tones that Sheriff Bauman was raising a body of men to go up and scout Cold Hollow. When he asked me whether I would join them, I didn't question. I just slung my old rifle over my shoulder and rode off into the misty dark with him towards town. Bauman rallied us along Main Street, some 12 men made fearless fools by war. After reminding us we'd seen the worst that man had to offer and a Wilderland farm could harbor no worse, he led us up the winding way. The pre-dawn sky overhead was choked by clouds, and the woods closing in around us were wreathed in Appalachia's storied mists. Though none of us save Donald and Bauman knew what might await us in the little hamlet, we held our weapons tight and twitched at every noise, the gravity in their tones telling us all we needed to know. Truth be told, I don't know if they fully grasped the gravity of the situation in the hills, for I can't believe sane men would march up there with even a hint of how bad things had gotten around Cold Hollow. Donald and Bauman were, most likely, only slightly less blind than the rest of us. If even a glimpse of that horror had found us on the rocky road up the mountains through the morning mist, not a soul would have plodded along the road towards that moldering doom. Providence wasn't so kind to us, though, and by the time any among the party had noticed something was foul, we were already in its clutches. At length, cresting the final ridge some miles from Moorhead, we saw what we first took as queer, elongated trees jutting up from the forest around Cold Hollow. I struggle now to describe them, for there are no analogous fungi upon the earth. When one thinks of stumps in wetlands or fallen trees in low valleys on cool spring mornings, any well-traveled outdoorsman might imagine a stinkhorn. Many of the mushrooms have long, tendril-like stalks of a bright, reddish-orange color, which draws the eye as unnatural amongst a sea of wholesome greens and browns. There in Cold Hollow, sprouting from tall trees which had been healthy not a month ago, were flowering groups of similar tendrils, grown giant by some unholy anatomy. Their 40 or 50-foot bulks swayed absently despite the calm morning air, and even though the sun had yet to fully crack the horizon, we could see that the forest beneath them was drained of color, its silent residents dead and bare, as if winter had fallen early on this lone, forsaken mountaintop. The whole scene was wreathed in the faint stench of aged dung, wafting on tepid air about us on the ridge. Some among the group, shaken by the sight, advised we turn back, but stalwart Donald spoke of the children and bade the group wait at least until the fate of the Kitchener family was known. None would sleep well, he advised, if the party ran for Moorhead only to leave people in need of help suffering in Cold Hollow. While I knew even then that I'd never sleep easy again, I allowed myself to be led on with the others, guilt and the desire to help forcing my stride. Lincolnites they might have been, but whatever hell had fallen upon the Kitcheners was beyond undeserved. The path into town wound past the oldest homes in the county, where Greg Kitchener's younger siblings had dwelt with their families. The grass had withered, browned under the shade of the unnatural tendrils up above as if bleached by a desert sun. Corn and potatoes growing on family plots had been equally stricken, and all amongst them, white and red stalks ending in drooping points rose from the earth, swaying and dancing in time with the stalks on the trees up above us. Some were small, no larger than tufts of grass, and some were massive, rivaling a man in height. We gave all of them a wide berth. Bauman, making for one of the old houses, had made it almost to the door to knock before we spotted the boy, Ronnie, in one of the potato patches. He stood with his slender arms outstretched amongst the red and white stalks, head turned towards the sluggishly rising sun. We pushed up to him, knocking down some of the surprisingly fragile stinkhorn things in the process, calling his name all the while. We all went mute when we got in close, though. Nothing could have prepared me, or any of the rest of us, for the sight of that poor boy's face. His eyes were lopsided, the discolored brown-black left socket swollen shut, and the right inflamed and pink with weeping mucus. The nostrils of his nose had split up the sides, and the whole yellowish fissure which had formed there was seeded with those otherworldly red stalks, jostled by the rattling breaths which issued from the wound. When Bauman, fighting back tears, asked Ronnie through shaky gasps where his family were, his mouth fell open to reveal a filmy black mass within where his tongue had been. I've seen heads hove in by cannonballs and stomachs split with grape shot, but nothing compared to Ronnie Kitchener's swollen skull that summer morning in Cold Hollow. Scattered about him in the growth-throttled field, only obvious to us once the shock of Ronnie himself had been overcome, were the other Kitcheners of Cold Hollow. Some, like his brother Edward, were not much more decayed than he, but others were so far gone it was impossible to recognize them. Greg, his legs now rooted to the soil by thick tendrils which had broken from the tips of his toes, and his head almost entirely engulfed by reddish stalks, was only identified by way of the engraved revolver on his hip. Some 27 of them stood there, pale as ghouls in the morning sun, the final testament to a withered community. At their center, near the edge of the field where the clearing met the dying woods, a shorn ditch in the soil, choked with fungal growth, spoke to the star which had fallen upon Cold Hollow on the 4th. We tried to shift some of the less mutilated Kitcheners from the field, but a kind of filmy mycelium reminiscent of centipede legs had sprung from the soles of their feet into the soil, and they screeched an unnatural, hollow screech through their open noses whenever this was disturbed. At last, Donald and I resolved to do what had to be done, for none of the others had the stomach. We strode from man to woman, and from woman to child, Bauman's scattergun in hand, and ended each of them. The husks withered when their heads had been destroyed, crumpling down into heaps with their legs unnaturally rooted upright amongst the lifeless potatoes. Then we all withdrew, none speaking a word, eyes ever on the stalks wavering in the windless day up above us. That afternoon, the party set fire to the woods around Cold Hollow with the help of posses of men raised from all across the county. Though the fires swept wide through the drought-stricken woodland and devastated more of the hills than we intended, none of those in the know spoke of why the blaze had been set, or complained about the barns and logging stations lost in the conflagration. Donald never did sit right after Cold Hollow. He feared, as did most of us, that we'd fall ill and end up like the Kitcheners. The fact that whatever spore or pollen fouled the air up there must have required more time to seed a host than we provided it didn't comfort him, though. Each summer weighed heavy upon him, and it was often I'd find him drunk on his porch in the night, staring toward the hills and mumbling to himself about dark days it didn't do to dwell on. When Liza found him dead in the woods by his own hand in 1874, I knew it was the Cold Hollow meteorite that was to blame, not the tumultuous stress of the times. Bauman died the following winter, and many more from the party in the decades after that. Last I knew, only old Rowan Goldie from Olive Hill was left, and that was back in the summer, before the influenza took me and drove me to flee for the hospital out in Louisville. He must be 80 by now, perhaps older. The number of those who knew the tale of Cold Hollow is fast fading, and for the graveless dead of the Kitchener family, we are the last testament they can expect to receive. I can only hope this retelling does something to convey the bond they must have shared, to struggle together those last horrible weeks There will be those, seated around the comfort of their hearths and sheltered by many intervening miles from the brooding hills of Kentucky, who scoff at what I describe. They will deride it as the fiction of a dying man, or, perhaps more charitably, the ramblings of a decaying mind. I confess this not for any small readership of folklorists and local historians this account might find, but to clear my own head of the beasts lurking there before the end. I pray that fate smiles enough on this earth that whatever unholy conspiracy of chance next hurls such wretched devastation from the cold stars towards the globe misses its mark. For my own sake, when at last I close my eyes, I pray it is a clear and welcoming sunrise that I see, and not the brooding stalks of some ailing alien growth, clawing at the gray, dour sky